Policy Committee hearing on House Bill 1250. Representative Donatucci requested that we do this hearing today, and what I'll do is I'll get members to introduce themselves. I'm State Representative Mike Sterla from Lancaster, and I chair the Democratic Policy Committee. I'll get the other members to introduce themselves, and then I'll turn it over to Representative Donatucci, who has a few comments, and then we'll introduce our first testifier. Let's start over here.
Good afternoon, State Representative Mark Gerkley, Allegheny County.
Good afternoon, State Representative Aaron Mulchaney, City of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County.
Good afternoon, Representative Jim Roebuck, Philadelphia.
Representative Brian Sims, the 182nd District, which you're all in at the moment.
Good afternoon, Representative Dom Costa, 21st District, Allegheny County, City of Pittsburgh.
Good afternoon, Pat Harkins, 1st District, Erie.
Good afternoon, Representative Jarrett Gibbons from the 10th District, Beaver, Lawrence, and Butler counties.
Tom Calligerone, Reading, Berks County, 127th.
Representative Nick Kodik, 45th District, Allegheny County.
Representative Mark Cohen, 202nd District, Lower Northeast section of Philadelphia.
Dan Frankel, Allegheny County.
Mary Jo Daly, the 148th District in Montgomery County.
Representative Chris Sinot, I represent the 9th District in Lawrence County.
Good afternoon, Representative Mark Longetti, 7th District, Mercer County.
Representative Steve McCarter, House District 154, Montgomery County, and little piece of Philadelphia.
Thanks. And I want to thank PCN for covering us again today on this important issue. I'll now turn it over to Representative Donatucci, who can tell you a little bit about House Bill 1250 and introduce our first testifier.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon. And I'd like to welcome everyone to today's House Democratic Policy Committee public hearing on equal pay in the workplace. We're joined today by several experts on this important topic, and I'm looking forward to hearing their testimony as we work to eliminate the gender wage gap. The wage discrimination is a very real problem in our state and has been for quite some time. Women make on average 77 cents for every dollar men bring in. However, this number can drop dramatically depending on where a woman lives. The gender wage gap also affects all classes, although it hits our middle and lower classes the hardest. These women are doing their best to provide for themselves and for their families, many taking on multiple jobs to try to make ends meet. By continuing to pay them less than what they're worth, we harm them and our communities as a whole. How do we fix this glaring problem? The state has its own equal pay law, but its penalties haven't been updated since 1959. That's the same year Alaska and Hawaii became states and Dwight Eisenhower was president. As we know, a lot has changed since then. It's time we update these penalties to show employers we're taking this issue seriously, and we won't tolerate discrimination in any form. My House Bill 1250 would do just that, and I'm hopeful it will be considered for a vote soon. As we work together to get rid of the gender wage gap, let's keep in mind the young girls who are watching their mothers, sisters, and other family members get paid less than men for the same work. What kind of message are we sending to them if we tell them they shouldn't expect to be rewarded fairly for their work? It's up to us to change the system now so they don't have to face discrimination in the future. So thank you again for attending, and I'll hand things over to the first panelist, and that is Terry Thompson, Managing Attorney for the Women's Law Project. Thank you.
I don't think so. Press me.
The button. Thank you. Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I want to thank Chair Sterla, Representative Donatucci, and the members of this committee for convening this hearing today on pay discrimination against women. My name is Terry Fromson. I'm Managing Attorney of the Women's Law Project, a nonprofit legal advocacy organization with offices in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. We seek to advance the legal status of women and girls through litigation, public policy, advocacy, public education, and individual counseling. We work on a variety of legal issues, including sex discrimination in the workplace. I have provided the committee with more extensive testimony in writing for the record, but in the interest of time have shortened my presentation. Workplace discrimination impoverishes women and harms their health physically and emotionally. Ensuring that women are paid fairly will promote both the economic security and health of Pennsylvania women and their families. By increasing penalties for noncompliance with Pennsylvania's equal pay law, House Bill 1250, introduced by Representative Donna Tucci, will promote equal pay. Other legislative initiatives, some of which have been introduced as the part of the Pennsylvania Agenda for Women's Health, excuse me, such as Representatives Mulchaney's and Sims' House Bill 1890, and some of which we hope will be introduced in the future, will raise women's pay. Gender-based wage discrimination is unfortunately alive and persistent in Pennsylvania as well as elsewhere. Although significant progress was made in closing the pay gap following the adoption of the Equal Pay Act and Title VII in the 1960s, that progress has stalled. The ratio of women's pay to men's pay narrowed only by 1.7% between 2004 and 2013. Women are still paid far less than men. In Pennsylvania, women working full-time, year-round, are paid 76 cents to the dollar paid to men. For women of color, the gender pay differences are much larger. If this slowing of progress continues, women will not achieve parity with men until 2058. Pay disparities impact women and their families on a daily basis throughout their lives. More than ever, women are relied upon to support families. In almost two-thirds of families with children, women are breadwinners or co-breadwinners. Women are primary breadwinners in more than 41% of families with children and co-breadwinners in another 23%. They bring in at least and often more than 25% of family income as co-breadwinners. Families that are low income are the most likely to have female primary breadwinners. For these women and families, pay discrimination means less money for food, clothing, housing, health care, and other necessities of life. There are people who say disparities in pay between men and women are not based on gender discrimination. They say the differences are due to non-gender factors, which they identify as differences in jobs, education, experience, hours of work, and time off for babies. They say these are all voluntary choices by women. They are wrong. First, it is clear these factors do not explain away the pay gap. Research has found a gender pay gap remains even after controlling for these factors. Second, to the extent these factors have any impact on the gender pay gap, it is because they are inherently influenced by gender bias. Let's start with the occupational differences. Research shows that even in the same occupation, women make less than men. This is regardless of whether the occupation is predominantly held by women, predominantly held by men, or held by a mixture. One study found that women made less than men in 109 of 112 occupations. Another found that men's median salaries exceeded women's salaries in all but one of 265 major occupations. This pattern is true in the highest and the lowest paying occupations. On the high end is the medical profession. Although women now represent nearly half of medical students in the United States, research shows a starting salary gap of $16,819 between men and women who graduated from medical school in New York between 1999 and 2008. This gap is not explained by gender differences in the on-the-job productivity or in choice of medical specialty. On the low end, in the male-dominated occupation, janitors and building cleaners, a male earns $511 weekly, while a woman makes only $408 weekly. In the female-dominated occupation of maids, housekeeping, and cleaners, men still make more, getting paid $425 a week, while women are paid only $395 a week. Same job, different pay, not a woman's choice. These examples take us to the other aspect of sex discrimination that pervades the occupational factor issue. While we no longer label want ads as for men only or for women only, we still have fields that are dominated by one sex or the other. In 2012, only 6% of women were employed in non-traditional occupations for women. These are occupations like carpenters and auto mechanics. Only 5% of men were employed in jobs that are non-traditional for men, like housekeepers and secretaries. The impact of gender segregation in job falls on the women-dominated jobs. That jobs dominated by men pay more, and that this disparity contributes to the pay gap are not debatable. Only 2 of the 25 occupations with highest median weekly earnings for full-time workers are majority female. We do dispute, however, that women voluntarily choose not to pursue jobs historically occupied by men and choose instead what is traditionally called women's work. It is sex discriminatory hiring and pay practices that exclude women from male-dominated jobs. Stereotypes and assumptions about appropriate work for, productivity of, and commitment to work by women and mothers pervade our labor market. Take, for example, the managers at Walmart who paid women less because men are working as the heads of their households, while women are just working for the sake of working and to get extra money. These discriminatory perspectives lead to lower pay for women, lower wage brackets for jobs dominated by women, refusal to hire women for jobs historically held by men, qualifying requirements such as physical requirements that have no bearing on job performance but exclude women, and employer toleration of coworker harassment of women who try to break these barriers. Whether it's a female firefighter, construction worker, or police officer, women are driven out of higher paying jobs held mostly by men. Nor does experience justify differentials in pay. Research that controlled for experience and other measurable qualifications still found pay differences between men and women. Differences in education are also not to blame. In the 2009-10 academic year, women earned the majority of bachelor's, graduate, and professional degrees. Nonetheless, 1 year out of college, they experienced a wage gap of 82% of the wages paid to their male counterparts. In each educational bracket, women are paid less. Women who do not complete high school are paid 69% of what the equivalent men are paid. Women with a bachelor's degree are paid 74% of what male college graduates are paid, and women with doctorates are paid 77% of what men with doctorates are paid. Nor is the gap accounted for by differences in hours work. Although mothers do tend to work less than fathers, when women request part-time work, they're often paid less than men who request the same flexibility. This is what happened to a public defender in Blair County, for example, who was paid less than her part-time male colleagues when she returned to work part-time after the birth of her child. Research has shown that mothers suffer an unwarranted motherhood penalty because of employer stereotypes rather than by their choices. Employers pay women less from the moment of hire, deny them promotions because they presume women will have children and then will commit less time and dedication to their jobs. Essentially, women are penalized for their capacity to become pregnant. Once they are mothers, they are further penalized. Mothers earn only 69% of what fathers earn and experience a per-child wage penalty of approximately 5%. Mothers are considered less competent and less committed. Fathers, on the other hand, experience a bonus when they become fathers. They are seen as more committed to their work and offered higher starting salaries. Another charge leveled at women for causing the gender wage gap is that they don't negotiate for better wages like men do. But women do ask for higher pay. But when they do, both men and women respond negatively and are less likely to want to hire and work for them. Women who ask for raises are viewed as demanding and uncooperative. Men who ask for raises are not viewed negatively at all. To the extent that women initiate negotiation less often than men, they are most likely responding to this very real social disincentive to negotiate. Our courts continue to get complaints from women who are paid less than men in the same job. In the last decade, Pennsylvania courts considered these kinds of cases. The female vice president whose salary was $10,000 to $20,000 less than the other 3 male vice presidents, all of whom received higher bonuses than she did. The senior consultant who was hired at a salary $15,000 less than the man hired 1 month after her. A high school principal was paid $10,000 to $15,000 less than equally positioned male principals. and a female manager who was fired when she complained about being paid $14,000 less than a similarly situated male coworker. While these cases were filed and allowed to proceed in the face of employer opposition, they likely represent only a fraction of the instances in which women are paid less than comparable men. Many women are unable to challenge their pay at all. Some are unaware of being shortchanged due to employer bans on talking about wages. Some appropriately fear retaliation and loss of employment for questioning their pay rate. The concerns of women and families have received a lot of deserved attention lately. People are expressing their support for raising wages for women by paying them equal pay for equal work and protecting job security for mothers who are also workers. The Pennsylvania General Assembly is in a position to respond. If adopted, HB 1250 will increase employer penalties for violations of Pennsylvania's equal pay law. It will raise penalties from the range of $50 to $200, established in 1959, to a range of $400 to $1,600. An increase in penalties will certainly increase the incentive for an employer to comply with the law. As originally introduced, however, HB 1250 increased these penalties even more, to a range of $1,000 to $25,000. It also increased the time period in which a pay discrimination claim could be filed. In light of the passage of 55 years and the persistence of wage discrimination based on sex, we urge the House to revert to the prior printer's number and adopt the strongest bill with the strongest deterrents and remedies to eradicate pay discrimination. A number of other proposals in the Pennsylvania Agenda for Women's Health will also advance working women's equality in health. By amending Pennsylvania's equal pay law to require greater scrutiny to pay differences, HB 1890 will ensure that any differences that exist are in fact based on a bona fide factor other than sex that is job-related and consistent with business necessity. HB 1890 will also remove the pay secrecy obstacle that prevents women from finding out if they are paid differently. This bill can be further strengthened by amending it to cover all employees in Pennsylvania and to expand the remedies a court can order to include reinstatement to employment and punitive damages. Other pending bills will allow pregnant women and mothers to maintain their employment. HB 1892 will require reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers. HB 1895 will require sanitary nursing accommodations for working mothers. Adoption of paid family leave and a prohibition on familial status discrimination will keep caretaking employees in the workforce. Increasing the minimum wage and taking steps to elevate pay levels for women-dominated jobs will help women achieve parity. Thank you for convening this hearing and giving me the opportunity to share with you what I have learned about the gender wage gap.
Okay, we do have questions. I just want to ask one before I hand it over to my colleagues. We have all these statistics. Are people getting fined for this?
In Pennsylvania?
Anywhere.
I don't know the answer to that question, I'm afraid. I mean, litigation is brought, and sometimes it's successful, and and sometimes it results in a resolution that we're not aware of.
Right. I know across the country, I had read statistics that it was a really large amount, and there was $24 million in payouts because of that to the victims.
But I'm sure that there are many more victims who are not able to come forward because they don't have the information they need in order to determine that they're being paid less or the ability to proceed with an action.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman Sanada?
Thank you, Representative Donatucci. Thank you, Ms. Fromson, for your testimony. And this is a learning experience, I think, for many of what you're saying. I just need some clarification. When someone posts a job, okay, isn't a salary there? I mean, I think of us in the legislature, we're all paid the same amount of money. whether it be one of our female legislators or male legislators. If you're a school teacher, you have a salary scale, whether it's a male or female. If it's a state worker, there's a salary structure, okay? How does this occur? I mean, because if an employer is if there's a job, just
Yes.
use it at Walgreens, and they'll say the salary is $50,000 a year. How is a woman paid less than a male if that salary is a $50,000 a year job? I mean, try to enlighten me here, because my experience has been they say what the salary is, and whether it's a male or female applying, the salary should be the same. The woman shouldn't be making 25% less for the same job. That makes no sense.
I think there certainly are jobs which have strict salary schedules, but there are as many jobs that don't, and that the salary allocated to a particular individual is that, individualized.
So you're saying this is a type of job. Could you give me an example of that?
I haven't researched all jobs to be able to answer that for you. I know, I guess from personal observation, that there are jobs that are advertised without a salary, that people walk in the door, they're interviewed, and that the salary is discussed later, but I couldn't give you the title of the job. Sorry.
No, I'm just, because I'm saying is, to my experience is, my mother was and she was our only breadwinner because my father died when I was 12, and she became a state worker, but she made the same salary as the male that worked next to her.
I think public jobs are more likely to have the sort of salary scale that you're discussing, but not necessarily jobs in the private sphere.
Okay, I just think that, I mean, everyone should be paid the same amount of money. It shouldn't be based on gender, it shouldn't be based on anything. That's why I think this hearing is so important. I know Representative Donna Tucci has been very vocal on this issue, and that's why I think you see so many legislators here today to try to learn and understand what exactly, where is the problem. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Daly.
Thanks, Representative Donna Tucci, and thanks, Ms. Fromson, for your testimony. The question of secrecy about, your salary is what really intrigues me. So do companies, do you find that companies or employers have that written into their HR policy manuals that you're not to discuss jobs, or is that one of those unspoken rules that you're not to discuss salary?
I think it's both. There clearly are written rules about pay secrecy, because I've seen them where they've been able to be challenged. There are states that have laws prohibiting this, but there's also an active discouragement of talking about salaries. There was a study in which I believe 61% of the respondents say that their employer either has a written policy or a discouragement of talking about wages.
Okay, and I would just like to say that I had a former employer that used very broadband salary ranges, so depending on your education or your experience, you would fit somewhere within that broad range as determined by budgetary and other factors, and I just wonder if those would be reasonable reasons that there could be pay discrepancies, or would there be more objective ways to make that determination?
So there clearly are factors that are non-gender related that would be a legitimate basis for differentiating among wages. The question is whether someone is being denied an equivalent pay rate because of her sex, or genuinely because of experience or education. But the studies that have looked at all those factors and weeded out all of the non-gender factors still are left with a gap.
Okay, and I just would like to make a comment that in having had different jobs prior to being in the legislature, I think there can be a pride thing in terms of, you go and you apply for a job and maybe there's a range of salaries, or maybe you've been at a place for a long time and, you think you're doing pretty well, and then you find out later that, no, you're not really doing all that well when in comparison. And so I actually think there are a lot of factors in addition to the ones that you've talked about with, in how an individual, I think how women approach jobs. And I was certainly a single mom for a number of years, and then my job was always important to my family's income. So I can identify this. I think what this bill and this topic does is it really, it makes you go back and look at jobs you've had and did you really settle? And I think that sometimes jobs are so important to, to a woman who is in that situation that I think probably a lot of us have settled over the time.
I think you're probably right, and that's why it's important for us to understand that these wage scales are set incorrectly for different jobs, and that just because a job is mostly occupied by women, it doesn't mean it's valued less. That it is an equivalent kind of job. The cleaner and the janitor are really very close, and yet the women are being paid less, and even the men are being paid more when they work in that traditional women's sphere. So there's definitely a sex factor involved in what's going on here.
So I think just encouraging women to talk and not, I think learning more about this secrecy factor actually would be really helpful, because I think, that's something you talk about that, and then people, it's kind of surprising to think you can't talk about it, and yet it shouldn't be surprising, quite honestly. I'm old enough to have lived long enough to know that we don't always talk about things that are important.
Right, and then we have to protect women from retaliation for talking about it, otherwise they will fear losing their livelihood.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you.
Caucus Chair Frankel.
Thank you. And I want to thank Representative Donatucci for having this hearing and sponsoring this legislation. And just a couple of comments before a question. As you noted, this legislation and House Bill 1890, sponsored by Representative Mulchaney and Representative Sims, who are with us today, are part of a broad agenda that we've been putting together through the Women's Health Caucus, the Agenda for Women's Health in Pennsylvania. And I know the Women's Law Project has been an integral part of helping to formulate that. And I want to thank you. Some people ask, why is equal pay part of a women's health agenda? And I know the answer to that, but maybe you'd like to explain why that's important.
I'd be happy to do that. A couple years ago, the Women's Law Project produced a report called Through the Lens of Equality, Eliminating Sex Bias to Improve the Health of Pennsylvanians' Women. And we looked at multiple realms of women's lives, home, school, and the workplace among them. And we found a lot of research that supports the fact that sex discrimination harms women's health. The stress caused by all of this discrimination and the hardships in the workplace affects them physically and mentally. So there's more depression, there's risk of heart disease, risk of diabetes. These are all connected, connecting discrimination and women's health. And so remedying this problem is very important to the health of Pennsylvania.
And the economic security issue as well, being able to afford health care.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you on that. And people should know, and I know there are many members of the Women's Health Caucus who've been at this meeting here today who've been working for this, but it's really an unprecedented effort that we've put together, that it's not just the House, and it's not just Democrats or Republicans. It's bipartisan. And as you can see from Representative Donatucci's bill, it is bipartisanly co-sponsored, which I think is also significant. So we've been working to try and communicate this across the board. One last question. we did pass a bill, a resolution to once again study pay disparity in Pennsylvania. You cited a great deal of information here. It seems to me and to many of us, even though we voted for it because it was better than nothing, we believe that it's time to act. But is there anything left to study on this issue, really? I mean, it seems a very compelling case, a lot of information that you've communicated. We've heard even more. It's time to move on, I think. But is there rationale to continue to study this issue?
I don't see the need for any further study. I think there's a lot of research out there, and it all points to a number of corrections that can be made in our public policy to bring women up to parity. So I don't see the reason for any further research.
Thanks, Terry.
And thank you.
Representative Mulchaney.
Thank you, Representative Donatucci, and I want to thank the presenter to come here and present on such an important topic. Obviously, as part of the Women's Health Agenda, Representative Sims and myself also have House Bill 1890, which addresses the issue. I just have a few questions, but before I do, I wanted to kind of address, another representative had asked about published wages, and prior to serving in the legislature, I served in the nonprofit sector, and I will tell you that wages were not always publicized for positions. In some cases, positions are tied to grant money or, one-shot kind of influxes of cash. So sometimes it's difficult to gauge what some of these positions should pay versus what they do pay. So I think that across all the sectors, it's difficult sometimes to always mandate that things are published, and I agree that they should be. It's great that we do that in the public sector. I think it's really important. But without that, we are left with our own independent searches on things like salary.com and, looking at our own media, our own job markets. And, oftentimes, I know I've been asked this question when applying for a position, and that's, well, what did you make at your last job? And I think that there's a very common theme to that when it comes to what women kind of walk in with and say, oh, well, I was paid this. So then the employer consequently says, well, that's where we'll start you. And so that also becomes a cyclical problem, I think, in this this wage gap issue. But I have a couple of quick questions. First, is it correct in assuming or gathering from all this that the topic of wage secrecy and pay equity really hasn't been addressed in a comprehensive manner since 1959?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. I was just trying to remember where I was in 1959 and had some trouble with that. And then I also wanted to ask a quick question about, the impact that this has on retirement security. We've talked about what it's like to be a woman and be paid less throughout your career, but when you think about what happens when you retire, do you have any information on kind of the status of women at the age of retirement when it comes to their pensions and the retirement savings based on the fact that they were paid maybe not comparable wages to their male counterparts? I mean, I would think it would have a pretty significant impact on their retirement security later down the road.
I don't have any hard data on me, but I think we all know that retirement benefits, Social Security retirement, it's based on what you put in. So to the extent that women are earning less, they're going to have less to retire on. I think it's part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative McCarter.
Thank you. Several of my colleagues have asked a couple of the questions that I wanted to respond to in terms of your testimony, but let me go back and just add one quick comment dealing with, again, the wage differential in the public sector and what happens in schools. Since I had experience with that in negotiating contracts and dealing with the aftermath of what happens with people who come into a school district and are not paid the same, and often, and I would say more than often, it usually did fall on gender lines. And how that comes about is very simply, is if you're taking someone with no experience and you look at a salary schedule and the starting salary is $30,000 a year, everyone's paid the same. But it's when you come into the system coming from another school district or coming with experience, possibly military service or something else. And someone who makes that decision as the business manager or the personnel director uses a flexibility and a choice of how many years of service to give that individual. And I can say categorically that my experience was that the gender gap was real. No matter what you negotiated on the salary schedules don't always tell the whole story. And so you find categorically that women are paid less and don't get as many years credited for service coming from another school district as men generally did. And I saw that 40 years ago when I first started in education, and I saw it only a few years ago when I left education. So I can categorically say that it is there, and that's how it comes about.
Thank you for sharing that. It's important to know.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Terry, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Barbara Price? And Caryn Hunt?
Representative Donna Tucci and other esteemed representatives and distinguished colleagues. My name is Barbara Price, and I'm here today representing the American Association of University Women in Pennsylvania, known as AAUW. AAUW has been empowering women since 1881 and has been advocating for pay equity since 1913. AAUW members were there when President Kennedy signed into law the Equal Pay Act of 1963, and 50 years later, AAUW is still advocating for workplace policies and legislation to encourage and enforce fair pay. Thanks to the hard work of our members and coalition partners, AAUW provided leadership for the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, signed into law by President Barack Obama in January 2009. At the federal level, we continue to work for passage of the Paycheck Fairness Act to give women additional and much-needed equal pay protections. AAUW also has a number of resources available and has done a lot of research on pay equity, including The Simple Truth About the Gender Pay Gap, Graduating to a Pay Gap, the Earnings of Men and Women 1 year after college, and Start Smart, which is a salary negotiation workshop for women, these for college women. And these are the resources I'm using for my testimony. Obviously, we've made progress since 1963 when women were paid 59 cents for each dollar men were paid, but the pay gap still exists at 77 cents today. And this is the national average, but also reflects the pay equity between men and women in Pennsylvania. In 2001, Pennsylvania was ranked 34th among the states in pay equity between men and women, not great, but in 2012, we dropped to 40th. Not because Pennsylvania's pay gap increased, but because other states made progress in narrowing their pay gap, which Pennsylvania did not. Attached to my testimony is a chart which indicates where each federal congressional district in Pennsylvania ranks on pay equity, from the high of 91% in the 1st congressional district to a low of 69% in the 8th congressional district. Another issue of concern with pay equity is the pay gap is how it affects racial and ethnic minorities. Comparing men's and women's salaries among Latinos, Native Americans, African Americans, and Pacific Islanders, the pay gap is not as large as it is for comparing men and women who are white. It's 78% for whites and 79% for Asian Americans. However, when compared to white men, who are the largest group in the workforce, Asian women have the smallest pay gap of 87%, while Latino women have the largest at 53%. African American women are paid 89% of what African American men are paid, but that number drops to 64% in comparison with white men. These disparities have given rise to the concept of Equal Pay Day. This is the day each year that women have to work to, how long they have to work, to additionally work in order to make what a man made the previous year. This year, that day for all women was April 8th. However, that day is different for racial and ethnic minorities and mothers. Equal Pay Day is June 16th for African American women, July 20th for Latina women. For mothers, June 12th was the day when their earnings caught up to fathers' earnings from the previous year, because working mothers are typically paid 69 cents for every dollar working dads are paid. The gap remains consistent across age groups, levels of education, and for full-time workers across a number of occupations, such as 70% for financial managers and 84% for computer programmers. There are two occupations where progress has been made. Women pharmacists make 100% of what men pharmacists make. And counselors, where women make 103% of men's wages. And this is probably because there are more women in that profession. The pay gap costs a typical woman at least $400,000 over the course of her career. And this affects the amount of Social Security she receives in retirement and may also affect pensions. This contributes to many elderly women living in poverty. Another concern that AAUW has is the growing increase in student loan debt. 71% of college seniors who graduated in 2012 with a bachelor's degree have a loan debt averaging $30,000. While this debt is a problem for all students, it's more of a burden for women. As AAUW's research showed, 1 year after graduation, women are paid just 82% of what men are paid. Even controlling for such factors as college major, occupation, economic sector, hours worked, months unemployed since graduation, GPA, type of undergraduate institution, selectivity, age, geographical region, and marital status, graduating to a pay gap found that a 7% wage gap 1 year after graduation was still unexplained. So even though men and women pay equal tuition and take out an equal number of loans, because of the pay gap, it will take women longer to pay off their student loans. And questions still arise as to whether this pay gap is real or just a matter of choice, and some of it can be explained by different career choices that women make. Yet this does not fully explain the pay gap. In an earlier report, Behind the Pay Gap, that AAUW did in 2007, they found that a 12% unexplained difference in earnings among full-time workers 10 years after college graduation. The pay gap adversely affects women in many ways, and I want to tell you a few stories from AAUW's blog that will illustrate the effect of the pay gap on specific women. Curry, who was a design supervisor, worked for 5 years at a company that designed, built, and installed laser welding assembly systems. When she was hired, Curry said company officials told her they didn't negotiate pay. In 2003, the company was forced into bankruptcy, and employees had to go through bankruptcy court for their final paychecks. When Curry looked at the court's list of claims, she was heartbroken. People she had supervised had larger claims for 2 weeks of pay than she did. Graduate student and former technician Anastasia accepted the salary offered to her in her first job out of college. She didn't know she could negotiate. She found when she arrived for work as a technician that a few men with less education and less relevant experience had negotiated for more pay. I have a bachelor's degree in physics, Anastasia said. This guy who hadn't gone to college and couldn't do mental math was getting paid more. When educator Maxine started her career as a teacher in the early 1970s, the school district refused to give her the head of household pay that men received, even though Maxine was the sole earner while her husband was in graduate school. Later, Maxine went into public school administration and found once again that her gender and marital status was a factor in her pay. While trying to negotiate her salary, one of the board members told her, "You don't need as much pay because your husband is a professor and you have enough money." Lab technician Ellie and her female colleagues in a research lab at a teaching hospital fought pay discrimination in the late 1970s. In Ellie's lab were all women with college degrees. They learned that a male head technician without a degree, working in a much smaller lab with less responsibility, earned a salary 1.5 times larger than the female head technician in Ellie's lab. The women banded together and called in anonymous complaints to a U.S. Department of Justice pay discrimination hotline. To their surprise, an investigation and pay raises actually followed. And of course, let's not forget Lilly Ledbetter's fight for fair pay, which began with an anonymous note. After almost 20 years of working at Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, she received a note revealing that she, the only female supervisor, was being paid 40% less than her male peers were. Ledbetter filed a gender discrimination lawsuit in 1998 that made its way to the U.S. Supreme Court, only to have the court say in 2007 she had been paid unfairly long enough to make it legal. The court said it was my fault, she said, that I hadn't figured out I was being paid less than a man. Yet I was told that if I discussed my pay, I wouldn't work there anymore. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act helped regain ground lost as a result of the Supreme Court decision and reinstated employees' ability to have their day in court. So given all the research, the stories of unfair pay practices, and the pay gap for women, it is essential we do all we can to correct this unjust situation. AUW Pennsylvania continues to support legislation, the two bills that have been already mentioned, that ensures workplace fairness and equal pay protection for women. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee.
Thank you. And we'll have Karen's testimony before we field questions.
Hi, I'm Caryn Hunt, president of Pennsylvania Now. Pennsylvania Now is the state chapter of the National Organization for Women, which is the country's largest feminist political organization. We are a statewide grassroots nonprofit organization taking action to bring women into full participation in the mainstream of American society in true partnership with men. I appreciate and thank you all for the opportunity to speak here today on behalf of House Bill 1250. I'm grateful to Representative Donna Tucci for submitting this bill, and I'm grateful that it's moving forward. Any improvement in the pay equity law is a step in the right direction, and Pennsylvania Now certainly does support it. However, I must say that when the bill was originally submitted to committee, it had some real teeth in the form of stiff penalties for businesses that discriminate against their women workers. But when it came back out of the committee, those penalties were greatly watered down. And it gives the impression that the legislators on the Labor and Industry Committee, don't take equal pay for equal work seriously. A lifetime of wage discrimination adds up to pretty big numbers for women and pretty big numbers for their families who rely on that income. And I can assure you that the women of the Commonwealth and their families do take the gender pay gap quite seriously. You've heard the statistics. Pennsylvania women earn on average 76% of what white men earn in the same job. Women of color earn significantly less. The gender gap persists even after accounting for every conceivable factor related to wages. Business itself in 2014, moving at the speed of light, and yet the pay gap has persisted for over 50 years and hasn't even budged much in the last 10. It's a legacy of chauvinism and baseless disparity. It's not a matter of education. Working age women in Pennsylvania are actually more educated than their male counterparts. It's not a matter of experience, as we've heard. Women are paid less for the same work right out of college. I got that statistic from the AAUW. It's gender discrimination, pure and simple. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? Clearly, Representative Donatucci has offered partial remedy with House Bill 1250. After waiting 50-plus years, what is one way to speed up, closing that gap, the pay equity gap? Make it hurt to discriminate against women workers. Make it hurt sooner, make it hurt deeper, and give women workers greater access to the courts. It's a simple, just democratic concept, equal pay for equal work. And it should be a bipartisan principle. Half of Republican voters are women too, so I would think that it would be a bipartisan principle. However, Republicans block equal pay law is a fairly common headline. We see it all the time, and that's why my organization and I think the Women of Pennsylvania look to Democrats to lead on the issue of equal pay. Women make up half the workforce, as you know. Single women, including single mothers, who are the sole providers for their family and who on average make just 56 cents per dollar earned by their male counterpart, are an increasingly important voter bloc. 44 cents short every hour. Hour after hour after hour, you can bet this issue is important to them. It is crystal clear. Left to their own devices, businesses and industries in Pennsylvania will not move to close this gap. Without updated equal pay laws and stiff penalties to enforce them, working women will once again be put on the pay no mind list. 50-plus years is long enough to have waited. When our state legislators take this issue seriously, so will state businesses. While Pennsylvania now would like to see the penalties as stiff as originally devised in House Bill 1250, we do recognize that increasing them for the first time in all these years is a positive step forward. But we just ask that you also consider that how you can strengthen pay equity laws as you legislate, as you're legislating, and not weaken them. Increasing penalties for businesses that discriminate on the basis of gender, in combination with bills included in the Pennsylvania Agenda for Women's Health, such as House Bill 1890, which will reduce loopholes in the existing law and end pay secrecy, and bills to provide earned sick time, improve parental leave, and raise the minimum wage will all go a long way towards closing the gap and redressing the injustice, and we look to you to do those things. Thank you.
Okay, before I ask people to ask questions, I do want to comment on 1250. I liked it in its original form. That's why I put it that way. Yes. Unfortunately, I would have never gotten it out of committee if I didn't allow the amendment. However, it's tabled right now, and I'm willing to wait for a new session to put it back up to higher and stiffer penalties, because I think even those amounts are a joke in this day and age. They're not even a slap on the wrist. But
they're definitely better than $50.
Right,
but,
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it should hurt.
Thank you, Representative Gerkley.
Thank you, Representative. And as the Vice Chair of the Labor Committee and a member of the committee since I've been a freshman, I want to congratulate Representative Donatucci. This is a major step forward for us with a Republican-controlled legislature and governor's office. It was pragmatic. None of us were happy about it, but to her credit and Chairman Keller's credit, even getting that bill on the agenda was a win for us, and we should take it as that, and a step forward for all of us. And I think we have no retroactivity in any of this. Maybe we could look back, even look backs on the next bill that we look at for the women, that we could add some of that to the bill and some more teeth that would make these businesses pay a lot of attention to this equal pay gap that does exist. And I appreciate the graph that you provided for us, because I'm very proud of our Democrats in Congress, because the top four where the gap is less are all Democrats, three from the Philadelphia area, and Congressman Doyle from Allegheny County. And what's most discerning to me, being from Western Pennsylvania, is number 17, number 18, and number 14, which is the next least, are all from Western Pennsylvania. So if you're a woman from Erie County to Greene County, you are making less than your male counterparts at the highest average in the state of Pennsylvania. That does not help us in any way, shape, or form. And I just wanted to point that out, being from Western Pennsylvania, how discerning that is to me, and disappointing that we hold the record here, especially Congressman Murphy, which is right next door to me, and Representative Kelly, number 18 and 17. I would hope they would step forward and try to address this issue with us as we move forward in a bipartisan effort to hopefully correct the issues that exist for us in this pay gap. Thank you.
Chairman Sterla.
Thank you. Ms. Price, you talked about, women graduating with the same debt. You should never ask a question you don't know the answer to, but I'll ask it anyway. If I recall correctly, and from past testimony from other people, women also graduate with a higher GPA on average than men. And so from that critical point where you're looking at someone who essentially has the exact same work experience as a male counterpart and has a better GPA to then get paid less when they get a job, just seems to me that there's the glaring epitome of what's wrong with the pay equity issue, is that there's no way you can compare that beer drinking college guy to the studious woman college student and say, yeah, the guy gets a better pay grade than the woman does. I mean, there's at that point in time they both have that exact same degree and the exact same amount of experience. Only one has a better resume than the other one.
And that's exactly why AUW did that particular research, because they wanted to see, here we are, college kids. They're all graduating, same majors, and they controlled for everything, and still found this unexplained 7% gap out after a year of being in the workforce. And that's what precipitated them starting this whole workshop called Start Smart, which we provide to college and universities that are part of AUW, who are member partners, and it's really a workshop to teach college women how to negotiate a salary, because that's what they really need to do now. They really need to get out there and negotiate the salary, but so many people don't even begin to realize that they can do that, I remember when I graduated from college, I was so glad to get a job, I didn't ask,
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Daly.
Thanks, Representative Donatucci, and thanks to both of you for your testimony. So my thoughts are going to, you're talking about legislation in a number of areas that would be really helpful. And so I'm really actually encouraged by the number of male legislators who are sitting here at this hearing and listening to this. But I also, so I think this is a really good start, and I really appreciate Representative Donatucci having this hearing, and also Representative Sims and Mulchaney being here, because I know, they have the bill, another bill, 1890, that a lot of us are signed on to. So voting is one of the things I'm really interested in. Our voting numbers are down all over the place, and you have access to large memberships. And is this the kind of thing that you put out before your members? Because my blood pressure is going up as I'm sitting here. This is not news to me.
Yeah.
But, I'm a member of both of your organizations, so I think that really making a case for this, it's an election year where we're going to elect new Congress people, although I know a lot of people don't have challenges in their races, but I think just making it an issue that women really are vocal about, because I think, and also, representatives, senators, and the governor up, it just seems like that's another way to get the word out. You have the power of your membership to really spread the word, and you may already be doing this. I'm a new member of AAUW. I've been with NOW for a while, but it just seems like if women and men probably are going to join those organizations, then you have such a good audience. And I think that the stories that you included are really valuable, and the tools that you've put together are really valuable, so I really, truly appreciate that. But I feel like, we need more people in our legislature to be able to force this issue, and voting is a way to do it, and an election year is a way to really focus on it, because not everybody has clear sailing to victory this year. Some of us have opponents, but it seems that that should be a really important and,
It is a hugely important issue to our membership for sure. I mean, it's probably the #1 issue right now, believe it or not, for our membership. I mean, you know, reproductive justice and economic justice are, you know, right at the top of our list. So, and, you know, if you look at it nationally, you know, in the presidential race, single moms were really, you know, gave President Obama a huge bump, and then in the governor race in Virginia with Terry McAuliffe, single women, that's what, you know, he really attributes his win to. So
yeah, so thank you for your testimony and for your work in this area.
And just to let you know, since you're a new member of AAUW, AAUW has a national campaign called Get Out the Vote. It's my vote, and I care about it, and we do a lot every year to try and register people to vote. I already have dates scheduled in September to, at our community college, to register people to vote. And last year when I did it, I was pleasantly surprised at how many students said to me, "Oh, I'm already registered." So that was encouraging, you know. But you also want to let them know what the issues are, and that you know, you need to pay attention to these issues as women and look at who's voting this way. AAUW nationally provides a voter education material on how various, and this is at the federal level, how your legislators voted on our issues that we're following, and they do that every year.
And be in touch with their legislators, because that's important also.
Yeah.
And you are doing that, I know.
Right, yeah.
So thank you.
And it is a family issue. I mean, it's a woman's issue too, but it's also a family issue. And I think the more, you know, when families start looking at the money, I mean, believe me, everyone gets upset about it. So.
Well, Representative Sonato talked about, you know, that his mom was
right,
you know,
exactly,
the breadwinner in his family, and I think a lot of us have experienced things like that. But so I just really appreciate my male colleagues for being here today and taking time to be part of this. Thank you.
And thank you for your, Representative Frankel. Wait, we do have one more question.
Yeah, please, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the National Organization for Women, because they've been an active participant in establishing the women's health agenda in Pennsylvania as well. I want to talk a little bit about, particularly, you cited, Karen, some information, or Barbara, some information with respect to some specific professions that have less disparity,
Right.
pharmacy and so forth. Two of the biggest growth areas, certainly in my community in Pittsburgh, are healthcare and higher education, as well as technology. You know, as burgeoning employers really have been sustaining our community, particularly eds and meds, typically. So what does pay equity look like in those professions? And I also want to talk to you about, there's been a lot of information today in academia about the prevalence of institutions of higher education utilizing adjunct professors as a means to deal with you know, lowering their costs. Adjunct professors get paid less, don't have the same benefits and so forth. I mean, is there a gender issue with respect to how tenure is allocated, how full professorships and adjunct professors in academia, is that an issue as well? And maybe as well as in healthcare?
Right. I can't really address the specifics of the pay equity issues, but AAUW nationally has a group that we call the Legal Advocacy Fund, which basically supports women who are suing their universities for discrimination. And some of that can be pay issues, and some of it can just be not being granted tenure as a result, you know, when they should be, other people getting promoted over them, who may not have as much experience as they do. Obviously, the issue, and a lot of colleges are going this way, community colleges especially, doing this adjunct professor thing, where then they don't have to hire people and pay, full wage and also all the benefits that go with it. Because if you're an adjunct professor, then you don't get benefits, I don't know how that will play out as a result of the Affordable Care Act and people being able to get health insurance in other ways or not. You talked about people in healthcare, registered nurses. There's a 91% pay gap between men and women for registered nurses. In medical scientists, it's an 80% pay gap between men and women. Secondary school teachers, that's better. There's a 93% pay gap. So again, it's across the board. It goes through all the professions, and it's not something that's just going to get fixed overnight. But somehow we need this encouragement for employers to not do these things, to not pay people unequally.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Natalie Sabadish from the Keystone Research Center.
Good afternoon, Representative Donna Tucci, Chairman, and members of the House Democratic Policy Committee. My name is Natalie Sabadish. I am a research analyst at the Keystone Research Center, and I am pursuing a graduate degree in public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. KRC is an independent, nonpartisan economic and policy research center with a core focus on performance of the Pennsylvania economy from the perspective of typical families, which include many working women. I am here today to speak in support of House Bill 1250. I'll try to not overlap too much with the previous speakers and also offer some other solutions to decreasing the gender wage gap. It has been over 50 years since President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law, and as Representative Mulchaney said, even longer since Pennsylvania passed its own equal pay law. These were milestone pieces of legislation at the time, mandating equal pay for equal work. Even President Kennedy, however, maintained that although legislation was a significant step forward, much remains to be done to achieve full equality of economic opportunity. By amending the state's equal pay law and increasing penalties for unfair pay practices, House Bill 1250 represents another important step towards combating discrimination in Pennsylvania. Women are playing an increasingly important role in the Pennsylvania labor market. At the turn of the 20th century, very few women participated in the workforce. Most females stayed at home to look after children or look after the house, while men were the primary breadwinners. Women no doubt worked extremely hard, but their productivity was not rewarded in wages, and they were not counted as part of the labor force. World War II was a turning point for these women. As scores of men went off to fight in Europe, women took their places in manufacturing and other typically male jobs to support the domestic war effort. The gender composition of the Pennsylvania labor force has changed drastically over the past century. The share of women participating in the labor force, which means that they are either working or they're actively looking for a job, has steadily increased since 1979 and currently stands at 58% in Pennsylvania. The majority of this increase occurred between 1979 and the early 1990s and has stagnated since. Women now make up nearly half of the Pennsylvania workforce, as we've heard before, and many of these women are mothers, primary breadwinners for their families, and fighting to stay above the poverty line. While women are becoming an increasingly important share of the Pennsylvania workforce, they are making much less than men. The typical female worker in Pennsylvania earns only 81 cents for each dollar in median hourly wages as her male counterpart makes. This so-called gender wage gap has been halved since the early 1980s, but the pace of the decline in the gap is now so slow that we will not see pay equity for a few more decades. Real median hourly wages for women steadily increased through the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s, but have since been flat. Real wages now for women in Pennsylvania are actually lower than they were in 2002. Part of the gender wage gap can be explained by occupational segregation, which refers to the concentration of various demographic groups across occupations and also the distribution within one occupation. Some of this occupational segregation is due to self-selection on the part of the women, where a female worker may end up in a certain occupation simply because she chooses to. The remaining segregation can be attributed to employer discrimination in the hiring process or policies that screen out female candidates for non-job related reasons. When women began to enter the labor market in large numbers, they tended to be employed in professions such as nursing, childcare, and teaching. Women working full-time, full year in these low-paid, so-called pink-collar occupations may have annual earnings that flirt with the poverty line, especially for women with children. Although some occupations have been trending towards integration, others are still male-dominated or female-dominated. For example, 90% of child care workers in the state, 80% of wait staff, and 3/4 of cashiers in Pennsylvania are women. Alternatively, women make up only 2% of carpenters in the state and 10% of engineers. Women are notably missing from the science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM fields, which pay more than non-STEM jobs, and the gender wage gap in those fields is also smaller. Women are also underrepresented in leadership positions. Nearly a third of all lawyers nationwide are women, but only 1 in 5 law firm partners are female. Additionally, there are now 24 female CEOs at Fortune 500 companies, and although this is a record number, it only represents 5% of these large firms. Occupations that have the highest concentrations of men are paid more than those that employ mostly women, regardless of education level. Economists have found that the occupational segregation accounts for about 35 to 40% of the gender wage gap, and they've also shown that this is economically inefficient. But it prevents able people from moving into different occupations where they could perform just as well and would satisfy them more than the ones that they're in or those that are available to them. Not only are women concentrated in certain low-paid occupations, women are also being paid less than their male counterparts even within one occupation. For example, in 2008, lawyers and judges in Pennsylvania female lawyers and judges in Pennsylvania made nearly $28,000 less annually than their male colleagues. Female CEOs only earn about 80% of what their male counterparts make. Even within the 20 occupations that have the highest concentration of women, such as waitresses, social workers, and nurses, female workers earn less than their male peers. Another contributor to the gender wage gap in Pennsylvania is workplace discrimination. Despite various legislation aimed at preventing gender-based pay inequities, women across the state still face discrimination in the hiring and promotion process, especially in male-dominated industries. This unfortunate reality is a byproduct of shifting family structures and the emerging prominence of women as primary breadwinners. Workplaces have not adapted to these changing family structures by offering benefits such as paid leave, flexible work schedules, or childcare. Even though the number of women working is increasing, they are more likely to pick up a sick child from school or take care of an aging parent. Some researchers acknowledge the existence of a maternal wall, indicating a prejudice against hiring and promoting women with children based on the assumption that she will be less committed to her job. Unfortunately, companies have not adjusted to reflect these changing workplace realities, and they've had very little legislative incentive to do so. House Bill 1250 would expand upon the Pennsylvania Fair Pay Act, as well as similar nationwide legislation, including the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009, by increasing the penalties for unfair pay practices. Another proposal to decrease the gender pay gap is to raise wages at the bottom of the distribution. As has been demonstrated, female workers tend to be concentrated in low-paying occupations, including many minimum wage jobs. In fact, 6 in 10 workers in the state that would see a wage boost from increasing the minimum wage to $10.10 per hour are women. In addition to raising the overall minimum, increasing the tipped minimum wage in Pennsylvania, currently only $2.83 an hour, would help women in occupations such as waitressing and bartending. These workers rely mostly on tips and are particularly hard hit in economic downturns when consumers start to pull back on their spending. Another way to raise the wage floor is to increase unionization in low-paid service occupations, many of which also have high concentrations of female workers. Boosting wages at the bottom of the distribution will help working women, many of whom are mothers, earn sufficient wages to support their families. It is time to improve Pennsylvania's equal pay law, an important but outdated piece of legislation. We need to identify policies that will be successful in shrinking the wage gap and making the workplace more hospitable to women. These policies going forward must address the root causes rather than only implementing results-based mandates. Addressing these issues and reducing the gender pay gap will help working women and Pennsylvania families, as well as improve economic efficiency and provide countless social and economic benefits throughout the Commonwealth. By increasing penalties for discriminatory pay practices, House Bill 1250 is a good step in the right direction. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, Representative Cohen.
Certainly appreciate the leadership of Representative Tucci.
Turn the mic on. Yeah, there you go.
I appreciate the leadership of Representative Donatucci in getting this bill forward, and the leadership of other members here in pushing the general issue of pay equity. I haven't heard today anything about the role of unions in the workforce. Are there any studies available about unionized occupations and to what degree the issue of pay equity applies in union contracts? Representative McCarter indicated that even with unionized contracts, there still is some discrimination. Are you familiar with this issue?
So I think it's important to understand that there are two barriers with women facing an unfair pay gap. There's barriers facing highly educated, high-wage women in occupations such as management, where litigation might be more helpful, and their issues are about breaking the glass ceiling and reaching the higher echelons of management. And then there's other completely separate issues that are facing lower wage service occupation women, and they're fighting just to stay above the poverty line, and so policies such as minimum wage would help them. And I think also unionization would help them in these low wage service occupations. There's research out of the Center for Economic and Policy Research Center in DC, which says that women who are unionized will earn 20% more. It's about $2 more per hour just by being unionized. So I can't speak to the fact that there may still be a pay gap within unionized workforces, but I do know that unionizing women, especially in these low-wage service occupations, would do a lot to lift the wage floor and help shrink the gender pay gap.
Thank you very much. I would agree with that. What else deals with the issue of the minimum wage? Are there any studies comparing the gender pay gap in states that have higher minimum wages with states like Pennsylvania that have lower minimum wages?
I haven't seen anything like that, but as I said, over almost 6 in 10 women, studies have showed if you raise the minimum wage over the next few years to $10.10 an hour, over half of the people affected that would see increased wages are women, and many of whom are mothers.
Thank you very much.
Chairman Roebuck.
Thank you. I certainly too want to thank Representative Donatucci for focusing our legislative interest on this issue, and I think we've had a very good discussion. There's one thing, however, that I didn't quite understand in the testimony that was just given, and perhaps you could clarify for me. The example you used of the pay of lawyers and judges in Pennsylvania being unequal. I can understand lawyers. I don't understand how judges' pay is unequal, which I thought was mandated by law to be the same.
So when looking at this data, often you have larger occupational categories, then you can break down and look at, you have sample size problems when looking at smaller groups of data. So my guess, I can't say for sure because I didn't actually run these numbers myself, but my guess would be that in order to come up with this calculation, you would have had to keep this large occupational group, including both lawyers and judges. So maybe if you separated them out, you would see that the entire wage gap would be in the lawyer field and not in judges, but I can't say for sure.
Okay, well, I would certainly argue, at least, that the better example is to talk about lawyers being unequal, because I'm almost certain, it's like saying legislative salaries are unequal. They are not, as far as I know. or if they are, I'd like to find out whether I'm getting paid what I'm supposed to get paid. Maybe that's the issue. No, but I just say that because I do think that the examples are compelling, and I would hope that indeed they could be, that they are totally reflective of the reality of the situation. So it's just a small point, but one I hope that you'd look at. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Gerkley?
Thank you, Representative. Representative Cohen, I think it's indicative to look at page 3. In 1979, the median hourly wage in Pennsylvania was $20. I think our union households were probably by 10% more at that point in the Commonwealth than they are now. So I think we have overall, unions do play a role, and the fact that we don't have as many now is why we have less a wage earner, period, in Pennsylvania, men or women, and I think that's a troubling statistic. The question I have, though, is interesting. When you do look at that graph, 79, 2002, as you referred to, and then 2014, men's wages kept going down, women's wages were coming up, and now they've stagnated. So in 2014, your dollar's worth less, your buying power is worth less, we're getting paid less. When at the research center do you believe we're going to finally start to see the uptick again? And when that happens, will women's wages start to come up with that, or do you believe that that won't happen?
Well, I think, now that we're starting to see a little bit of a recovery in the labor market, the last few months of job numbers have been a lot more positive than previous months in the state. So that's definitely an encouraging sign, but I think it will also be a product of the public policy that comes out of the legislature. Again, going back to if the minimum wage is raised, that will affect a huge swath of the Pennsylvania workforce, and that will start lifting that line above stagnation. So I think it's largely a factor of the public policy going forward, and also hoping that the economy continues to recover at the pace and even faster than it has been the past few months.
I see Representative Frankel.
Thanks, and thanks to all the testifiers today. I just want to emphasize one thing that I think has not been emphasized and was addressed a bit by Representative Mulchaney and Ms. Fromson. But I think the issue of economic security for women in retirement is really a very significant issue. I mean, we have an enormous crisis in this country generally of people not being prepared to retire and not having the resources. But women are especially exposed for a number of reasons. Clearly, the fact that there is a disparity in pay and therefore a disparity in the ability to save for retirement or to benefit from pensions or to benefit from Social Security, but also the fact that women have longer life expectancies, outlive their spouses if they're married, and are so much more exposed, and we are facing really a crisis of seeing Americans generally not prepared for retirement, but really of older women in a position of really being relegated to poverty in retirement, even though they may not have been in poverty as they lived their lives. But really, I mean, this issue is, I think, a very important component of economic security and long-term women's health issues, and that we ought to spend some time talking about the implications of the pay disparity issue and economic security in retirement for women, and what it means also how, if women aren't prepared to be able to pay for their own retirement, who's going to do that, and where the resources in the community are going to be exposed as well in order to compensate for that. So it's, I think, an interesting aspect to this that we ought to spend some time talking about.
Sure, and I think it's also worth a mention that women are, as we said before, concentrated in a lot of teaching occupations and make up a large portion of the state public workforce. And any cuts to state pensions will obviously affect a large number of women going forward. As you said before, and as my colleagues have said before, what you pay into the system in a lot of cases is what you get out of it. So it's a lot of forces working against these women, even in terms of health insurance. A lot of these low-paid occupations with big concentrations of women are less likely to have health insurance. And, your health in the beginning years of your life, your working years of your life, obviously affect your health in the end of your life. And as you said, you start using more community resources, and it becomes more responsibility of the public to deal with those things that weren't dealt with earlier.
Thank you. And thank you, Representative Don Tucci. This has been really, I think, a terrific hearing. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Any other comments from members? Representative Don Tucci, any closing comments?
Yes, I do. I want to thank all the testifiers first off, and I can't wait to tweet all the information that I learned from you today. I want to thank all my colleagues that came today, especially knowing that there's all these men who advocate for this. It took women 144 years to get the right to vote. I don't want to see us go to 2064 before we have the same pay as men. And that will be my closing statement. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.